This is our first Saturday. For those of you who have not been to the Museum of the Memorial, at 10th and U Street Northwest, we have the African American Civil War Memorial, a statue called the Spirit of Freedom. On the walls behind that statue, we have the 209,145 names of all the soldiers that were officially brought into the Bureau of United States Colored Troops. At our museum and memorial, we tell the story of those American freedom fighters. And the best way to tell that story is from the primary sources and from researchers who dig through those primary sources to tell their individual family stories. And that's what our first Saturday is about. Descendants of these soldiers telling their story, how they found out about their soldier, their research process, what that soldier or those soldiers did before, during, and or after the Civil War. The story we tell is of American freedom fighters. I do want to point out that we are often taught that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation applied to 10 states, the 10 states in rebellion, and the 5 states, slaveholding states, that accepted federal authority. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply because Congress did not give President Lincoln the authority to declare free slaves in states that were loyal to the Union. Only in states in rebellion, in states that had been brought back in the Union by military conquest. The soldiers that we are literally answered a cry for help from the federal government. They helped save the Union, helped keep the United States together, and by enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, they become the liberators, the emancipators of their own families, of their own neighbors. These are the great emancipators. President Lincoln, we can call him the great facilitator. He helped to make it happen. But these soldiers, they are the emancipators. They enforce the proclamation. So today we're going to hear a presentation from a descendant of emancipators, from the liberators of the enslaved. For those of you who have not been there, we have a statue called the Spirit of Freedom. And on the walls behind that statue, we have the 209,145 names of all the soldiers who were officially brought into the Bureau of United States Colored Troops, separate department of the U.S. Army, established in the middle of the Civil War, May 22nd, 1863. Every name on our wall is backed by an official service record. One of the names on that wall is Benjamin Thompson. Benjamin Thompson served in the 82nd United States Colored Troops, and since we have some folk from Florida, I want to point out that that regiment spent a lot of time in West Florida fighting during the Civil War, emancipating folk. So during the middle of the Civil War, a separate bureau of the U.S. Army was established to accommodate soldiers of African descent. We get all of our names from official service records that can be found at the National Archives here in Washington, and the number 209,145 represents approximately 10% of the Federal Army during the Civil War. On our statue, we have a sailor, but we don't have any sailors' names on our wall of honor. The U.S. Navy during the Civil War was integrated, making it rather difficult to identify the men of African descent who served the Navy. We do know, however, from Department of Navy reports that approximately 25% of the Federal Navy was comprised of men of African descent. So that's 10% of the U.S. Army, 25% of the U.S. Navy. According to the U.S. Census 1860, African Americans made up 8% of the U.S. population, with over 90% living in the South. Yet African Americans made up 10% of the Northern Army, 25% of the Northern Navy. Now one would think, with this clear overrepresentation of African Americans in the Federal Army and Navy during the Civil War, that the story of these soldiers and sailors would have been an integral part of that master narrative presented over the last 100 years. Now one would think that, but that is not true. This was almost a completely suppressed story in the mid-20th century. Best example of the complete suppression of this story is 1944. In theaters across this country, you could have seen a film produced by the U.S. government entitled The Negro Soldier. The director of the film was Frank Capra, top director in Hollywood at the time. The Negro Soldier covered African-American military service in this country from the 1770s to the 1940s, mentioned African-American involvement in every war in the nation's history during that period, except the Civil War. There was no mention of a single soldier or sailor. That's 10% of the Army, 25% of the Navy, and during the Civil War, 25 men of African descent had earned the highest medal given by the American military, the Medal of Honor. Yet not a single one of those American heroes were mentioned in a film expressly about them produced by the U.S. government. Every first Saturday of the month in this museum, we have a descendant of one of the soldiers whose names is on our Wall of Honor come into this museum and share their research using primary sources. We are very fortunate that even though the government was suppressing this story in the mid-20th century, the National Archives was keeping the official records safe. Library of Congress, you can get narrative and newspaper prints to tell you, newspaper articles to tell you the true story of how Americans of African descent actually answered a cry for help from the federal government, helped save the Union, and freed themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the story that was being suppressed in the mid-20th century. And what we attempt to do is steer you toward the primary sources so you can discover for yourself the story of this glorious march to liberty.